Hi, I'm John Hornick. Welcome to lesson 40 of Chef's Apprentice, learning to cook like a pro, one small plate at a time. This lesson is pulled pork toast with roasted tomato and peach aioli. This braised pork dish uses an electric braiser, also known as a slow cooker, also known as a crock pot. The slow cooker is a great device for braising for a very long period of time, here 6 hours, at a constant low temperature. Here you will learn to make and use a rub and to pull pork and skim fat after a very long braise. You will also make a great roasted tomato and peach aioli, which is great with any pork dish, or with chicken, lamb, or fish. Techniques today are chopping, making a roasted tomato and peach aioli, making and using a rub, braising meat in a slow cooker, resting and keeping warm, pulling pork, adjusting seasoning, skimming fat, slicing, toasting, plating, and garnishing. So let's start cooking. Okay, let's talk about the mise en place for lesson 40, which is pulled pork toasts with roasted tomato and peach aioli. Of course, we're going to need pork. This is about 3 to 4, maybe 3.5 pounds of pork butt. Pork butt is shoulder, okay? All pork butt is shoulder, not all shoulder is pork butt, okay? So we have about 3.5 pounds of pork butt. You will have some left over for sandwiches tomorrow, probably. Should. I'm doing a serving for 8 tonight. You also need to have some of John's barbecue rub. Now I think I call it John's anything rub in the video, Sauces to Die For video on that topic. And it's made up of onion powder and garlic powder and cumin and some other things. And we're going to use this as a rub on the pork today, but you can really use it as a rub on anything. Okay, so that's why I call it John's anything rub. You need to have kosher salt and also a peppermill. You need to have about a half of a cup of red wine, dry red wine. And we'll need to have a baguette. Now, I haven't gotten the baguette today because I want to get it fresh, so we will show that later and we'll slice it. We need to have about 3 tablespoons of melted butter. How much do you need? Well, I'm going to be doing for 8 tonight. We're going to be brushing one side of each slice of baguette. They're going to be about 3/8 of inch thick. They're going to be 2 per person. So you just have to judge how much butter you need to butter that much bread. Okay? We need to have about 1 cup of the roasted tomato and peach sauce. There's a separate video on that, the Sauces to Die For series. And you'll also need about a half a cup of mayonnaise. Now this is store-bought mayonnaise. I'm using Kraft Light. There's also a Sauces to Die For recipe on making mayonnaise from scratch and aiolis. But today we're using store-bought mayonnaise. And you'll need to have about 2 tablespoons roughly of sliced scallion. I sliced them diagonally on bias because they look better. Basically I just sliced 2 scallions. Okay, that's all the ingredients that we'll need. We'll come back and go over the equipment for lesson 40. Okay, for lesson 40 we're going to need a cutting board and a chef's knife. We'll also need to have a bread knife to slice that baguette. We'll need to have a couple of forks for pulling the pork. We need to have a brush to brush the butter on the slices of baguette. And now we need to have, once we take the pork out of the slow cooker, we will need to have a way to get the fat off of the cooking juices, which are called fond, F-O-N-D. Now, if you have the time, just put them in a bowl, put them in the refrigerator. The fat will rise to the top. You can take the fat layer off and throw it away. If you don't have the time, you can use a fat separator. And I'm not sure how much time we're going to have today, so I have a fat separator here in case we need it. Of course, we're going to need to have a slow cooker. It's also called an electric braiser. It's also called a crock pot. This happens to be an actual crock pot brand slow cooker. Then after we have pulled the pork, we're going to need to keep it warm. So I have a double boiler. Now, a double boiler can be something like this, which is a pot with a double boiler insert, in French called a bain-marie, and a lid that fits on there pretty well. Now, if you don't have a setup like this, you can just use a pot and then a bowl that fits pretty well into the pot and a lid that fits on top of that bowl. Okay. Now, we will also need to have a bowl to put the fond into after we have removed it from the slow cooker. We'll also need to have a bowl to mix the pulled pork with the fond after we have separated the fat from the foam. We need to have a bowl to mix the aioli. I've already put the peach sauce into this bowl here, so we'll use this bowl and a wooden spoon to mix up the aioli. And then you need to have a funnel and a squeeze bottle. Now, we're going to put the aioli into the squeeze bottle, and we're going to use that for plating. Do you have to do that? No, you could just spoon the sauce onto the dish at the end. But we're learning to cook like a pro, so we're going to use a squeeze bottle. And I'm going to show you how to get the aioli into the squeeze bottle with this funnel, even though it's a fairly thick sauce. All right, that's all of the equipment that we need. We'll break now, come back, and start cooking. Okay, the first step on our prep list is to rub the pork and season it. I didn't talk earlier about how much rub you need. What you need to do is look at how much pork you have and figure out how much rub you need to cover that amount of pork. Now, if you do the sauces to die for recipe for the anything rub, you'll be making plenty of this rub, which you'll be able to use it on different occasions. So you'll have plenty of it. You just have to decide how much that you need to rub it, and you want to do it pretty generously. And once you want to take out what you need out of your container of what you've made, because once you get it, you're contaminated with your hands. You don't want to be putting that back into the container, and you don't want to be reaching into the container of the rub to get out more if your hands are contaminated with the pork. Okay, the next step is to put the pork into the slow cooker along with the wine. Put the cover on, set it on high, and let it braise for 6 hours. Now, while the pork is braising, we can do the aioli. Now, an aioli is a mayonnaise that has garlic in it. Okay, now because this roasted tomato and peach sauce does in fact have garlic in it, this is a true aioli. Now, a lot of chefs today will use, they'll make a mayonnaise sauce of some kind and they'll call it an aioli because it sounds better. But technically it should have garlic in it to be an aioli. This does have garlic in it. Okay. Okay, so I mixed this pretty thoroughly because I saw little lumps of mayonnaise in there. You can use your spoon, as you saw me do, to press the mayonnaise or the aioli against the side of the bowl, which helps to mix it up and get those lumps out. If you wanted to, you could also run this through a strainer to get it perfectly smooth. I don't think we need to do that. This is pretty smooth, but you can, if you wanted to have it perfectly smooth, all those little lumps gone, just press it through a strainer. Now we're going to put this aioli into this squeeze bottle. So we start with a squeeze bottle and then put a funnel into the squeeze bottle and then put some of the aioli into the funnel. And then what we do, it's not going to run down in there very easily because it's so thick. So what we do is we just take the funnel and we raise it up and down quickly, and the aioli all goes through the funnel into the bottle. Right? So we can do that with the whole amount, a little bit at a time. Okay, now one last thing about the squeeze bottle. Depending on how thick your sauce is, make sure that you have the top of the squeeze bottle cut wide enough so that the thickness of the sauce can get through the hole. All right, so there we have it. The roasted tomato and peach aioli in a squeeze bottle. All right, the pork has been braising for 6 hours on high. We're going to turn this down to warm for 30 minutes. The reason we do that is to allow the pork to cool in its liquid, which helps it to retain flavor and to retain moisture. So we'll come back in 30 minutes for the next step. So I removed the pork from the braiser, and it is so fall apart tender that it was falling apart as I was removing it. We'll get back to that in a moment. And now what we want to do is separate the fat from the fond. Now, if you can see in this fat separator, there's a layer about from here to here. That's all fat. And I want to get this done now rather than putting it in the refrigerator and letting the fat rise to the top. You can do that if you have time. Put it in the fridge, let it stay in there for a few hours, or overnight ideally. The fat will be on top, it'll solidify, then you can just peel that fat layer off and get rid of it. But since I don't have a lot of time, what I'm going to do is use this OXO fat separator, and just, it pours from the bottom, you see, so the fat will float on top, and so the fond is under the fat on the bottom. So you just pour into the bowl, watching to make sure that you don't pour down so low that you start pouring fat out of the fat separator. There. Okay, so it looks like we've gotten all the fat layer still in the separator, and we have the fond in the bowl. And we're just going to put that aside for a moment. Next step is to pull the pork. Now, first thing we want to do is remove the twine. And if we have any obvious areas of fat, we can pull those off. This is fat here, and get rid of that. And then what we want to do is start to pull the pork apart. Now, as we see any obvious pieces of fat as we go, we're going to put those in the fat pile. But otherwise, we're just going to pull this pork with a couple of forks. All right, now let's put this pork into a bowl. All right, now we're going to pour the fond into the pork, and we don't want it to be too soupy, but I think we can probably put it all in here, given the amount of pork that we have and the amount of fond that we have. Mix it up a little bit. All right, now let's taste it and adjust the seasoning. So I'm going to add a little bit more pepper. And just a little bit more salt. Okay, let's taste it again. Perfect. All right, now we want to keep the pork warm until we're ready to serve. And so I'm going to use a double boiler. Now I showed you this earlier. I put water into the bottom pan, and I put it up till it just touches the bottom of this pan. How do I know? I sit it down there, in there, it comes out wet, then I know I've got enough. I like to have as much water in there as possible, right up to the bottom of the insert, so that it doesn't boil out. We're going to put this on the stove at a low temperature to keep the pork warm, but if it's on there for a while, the water could boil out if you have the temperature too high or not enough water. So we want to put the pork into the double boiler. And then we're going to put this covered on the stove on low heat. All right, now the next step is to slice and toast the bread. This is a baguette. I didn't have it earlier. Now you can heat the oven to 350 degrees and do this on a sheet pan, or you could do it in a toaster oven. I'm only going to do one to plate up for the lesson right now, so I'm just going to use a sizzle plate in the toaster oven. So we want to cut the bread diagonally, and then we want a slice that's about 3/8 of an inch thick. 2 per person. So I'm going to just plate up one of them right now. Put them on our sizzle plate and brush them with a little butter on one side. Now we're going to toast them either in the oven at 350 degrees or in a toaster oven for until they are just a little brown, golden brown. So here we have some toast that are just nicely golden. Put them down on our plate. Right, now, as I said earlier, we're going to do 2 slices per person. So we want to put a little pork down on top of each one of these slices. Then a little of your roasted tomato and peach aioli. And then we want to garnish with some scallions. Okay, so that's the conclusion of lesson 40, pulled pork toasts with roasted tomato and peach aioli. You can see photos of the final dish, finished dish, at my Instagram, Chef's Apprentice, Cook Like a Pro. Next up is ribeye steak and a mirin pool. Please remember to subscribe to my channel, and thanks for watching.